Well, thanks everybody for joining. We have a terrific speaker today. It's my great honor to introduce my NYU colleague and our speaker for today, Professor Joseph LeDoux. I can't imagine a more appropriate speaker on the topic of consciousness right now. However, we often forget how much fate or chance can affect the direction of our careers. Dr. LeDoux majored in marketing for his bachelor's and master's degrees at Louisiana State University, but he stumbled into a course on motivation and learning that was all about the brain, and he fell in love with psychology. For his doctorate, Stony Brook University was the only school that accepted him, and there he was assigned to study the play of marmosets. Fortuitously, he met the distinguished neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga, famous for his work with human split-brain patients, and Gazzaniga became his doctoral sponsor at Stony Brook, which is also my undergrad alma mater, by the way. So thus, Joe got an early start on the study of consciousness. One of Joe's earliest publications from his work in Gazzaniga's lab involved the study of a patient who had the main connection between his cerebral hemispheres, the corpus callosum, severed in order to reduce his intractable epilepsy. Now, this hemispheric separation seemed to result in two half-brains, each with its own form of consciousness, a double consciousness that was observable because this unusual patient had linguistic abilities in both hemispheres. So a decade later, when Dr. LeDoux joined the faculty of NYU's newly created Center for Neuroscience, the focus of his interests had become the neurophysiological basis of emotion and emotional memory. This interest led to his groundbreaking research on the role of the amygdala in fear conditioning. Now, although he used rodent models for his research, the development of Joe's more human-based and philosophical interests can be traced through his very readable and successful books, beginning with The Emotional Brain in 1996, followed by The Synaptic Self in 2002, and then Anxious, Using the Brain to Understand and Treat Fear and Anxiety. That was in 2015. Then The Deep History of Our And his latest book, The Four Realms of Existence, A New Theory of Being Human, was published just last year. So now Dr. LeDoux was given the honor of becoming what NYU calls a university professor of neuroscience and psychology, and was elected to the National Academy of Sciences among his many honors and awards. And he's got like over 200 peer-reviewed publications, a bunch of books. He is currently the director of NYU's Emotional Brain Institute. But Joe is not only a highly respected scientist, he is also the lead singer and songwriter for the Amygdaloids, a rock band known for their clever songs about the mind, the brain, and mental disorders. Now, I've enjoyed several mini concerts given by his band. The title of his talk today is Our Four Realms of Existence, a fresh look at the science of what and who we are. And I couldn't be more delighted to turn the virtual floor over to Joe LeDoux.
Thanks, Barry. I know you didn't leave me much time with all that introduction. But,
oh, I could have gone on so much.
Yeah, you know, something I've been writing a kind of memoir lately, and something I realized in the process, which is relevant to what you said in the introduction, was that it turns out it really has always been about consciousness. The whole emotion thing was just a kind of excuse to try and explore behaviors that might unconsciously generate, might generate unconsciously controlled behaviors that we then have to cognitively interpret to make sense of them and so forth. But it was really all about consciousness, and especially in my most recent book, The Four Realms, which I'm talking about today, you'll see how I try to provide a kind of different perspective on all of this, or we'll see. Let's go with it. All right, let me share my screen, find my PowerPoint. Where to go? It's over here. Do I see it anywhere? Can you see that on the screen?
I do.
Oh, yes. Okay, good. Let me open it up then. Great. All right, four realms of existence. The publisher wanted to call it a new theory. I thought it was just more like a framework or an idea about being human, but sometimes you can't control these publishers. So anyway, it's a fresh look at the science of what and who we are. And I'm just going to move this thing out of the way. Okay. All right, many of us understand that the mental aspect of who we are is embedded in the part of the body known as the brain, and therefore is also part of our physical biological existence. Still, even true believers of the physical nature of the mind sometimes feel as though it possesses some quality or qualities lacking in other physical systems within our body and even within our brain. Just as your mind depends on your brain being part of your body depends on the life-sustaining functions of other components of your body. If your heart stops beating or your lungs collapse, all other organs, including your brain, will soon cease to function in a way that's compatible with life. Without bodily life, there's no brain function, and without brain function, there is no mind. So how then, out of all this biological physicality, do we each come to exist as a being that knows it was born in the past, knows that it exists now, and knows that it will someday die? The standard approach to such questions about individuality is to focus on psychological notions like the self or personality. These have long guided philosophical musings as well as scientific theories and research about what it is to be a human being. But there's little agreement about what self and personality refer to, and even whether they refer to real entities as opposed to just being shorthand labels for a variety of psychologically interesting phenomena. So David Hume called the self the elusive I. Sean Gallagher, a philosopher, said, despite the comfort level of the field to talk about the self, what is said is usually controversial. Daniel Dennett, the late Daniel Dennett, said the self is an illusion. Harry Stack Sullivan, a personality psychologist, said personality is illusion. Walter Mischel, another personality psychologist, said it's a myth. Owen Flanagan, a philosopher of mind, just because self is in our vocabulary does not mean it has any explanatory role. Thomas Metzinger, another philosopher, nobody ever had or was a self. And what I say is your self is not a thing. It's a story about who you are. So that's the only kind of like opening I leave for self in what I'm going to be talking about here. So scientific discoveries over the last several, and that goes back to the split brain work, by the way, this generation of narratives to explain these behaviors that we have coming out of our body all the time unconsciously. So scientific discoveries over the last several decades of diverse fields such as neuroscience, immunology, genetics, artificial intelligence have led to new ideas about human beings exist as physical systems. These findings and challenging cherished assumptions about human nature have resulted in an epistemological vacuum. In no small part, this is because thinking about who we are and what we are has not advanced significantly beyond traditional ideas some put forth in ancient times. So what if our constructs are inadequate as conceptual hooks on which to hang the empirical findings that have been discovered in the name of self and personality? Because these centuries-old ideas obscure as much as they reveal, the phenomena might be better served by a new conceptual home, one grounded in contemporary scientific conceptions and empirical research. So, a human being can be characterized as a composite of four fundamental, parallel, entwined realms of existence that reflect our evolutionary past and account for our present ways of being. These are biological, neurobiological, cognitive, and conscious. I'm sorry if you were expecting something much more mystical, but it's just like this is what we are: biological, neurobiological, cognitive, and conscious. All four deep down are biological, but the neurobiological realm transcends the mere biological. There are many organisms, most organisms alive are simply biological organisms. The neurobiological realm only exists in animals with a nervous system, organisms with a nervous system, and that includes only animals. Only animals have nervous systems. The cognitive realm transcends the neurobiological realm. In other words, some neurobiological creatures are cognitive, but many are not. And finally, the conscious realm transcends the mere cognitive. Not all cognitive creatures are necessarily conscious in the way we humans are. That doesn't mean they aren't conscious in any other way, but what I'm talking about here is humans. So these four realms coalesce as an ensemble of being. And together, the four realms and the resulting ensemble account for what and who we are, including those aspects of us that fall under the rubrics of self and personality. So one way to think about these, and it's not the way I'm going to be talking about it, is in terms of kind of the a reductionist approach, where you have like high levels are reduced to lower and lower and lower levels. This was called the unity of science at one point in philosophy. But that's not what we're talking about here. What I'm focusing on is instead how symbiotic interactions between these levels sustain the organism. It's not about reducing, it's about sustaining. So we have, you see at the bottom, the biological realm is what makes possible the neurobiological realm, and the neurobiological is what makes possible the cognitive, and the cognitive is what makes possible the conscious. So each realm anatomically permeates and physiological enables the level above it, but at the same time, the survival potential of the level below is enhanced by the one above. So let's just look at the biological realm enables the neurobiological, but you see this arrow coming back from the neurobiological to the biological because having a neurobiological way of existing makes biological existence much more effective. You can respond quicker, more efficiently, in many ways, the neurobiological realm makes the biological more efficient. So the realm somewhat resembles something like a Russian doll. But unlike a Russian doll, in which the parts simply stack on top of one another, our component realms are conjoined, integrated, and interdependent. Everything about an individual human being, biologically and psychologically, is subsumed within these entwined, nested, hierarchical organization of our realms of existence. A case could be made that society and culture are additional realms, but I believe these are things we do with our cognitive and conscious realms. So it's relatively easy to separate biological beings from non-living matter. If something alive is alive, it's a biological being. If it's not alive, it's not a biological being. No complication there. If you have metabolism and the ability to replicate and so forth, you're a biological being. These are features that define what a biological being is. Deciding which biological beings exist neurobiologically is also relatively straightforward. If an organism has a nervous system, even if it's a primitive nervous system, it's a neurobiological being, and by definition, it exists neurobiologically. So that narrows things down to animals, or at least most animals, because most animals have nervous systems, and nothing that is not an animal has a nervous system. But when it comes to the cognitive and conscious realms, things are considerably more complex, since there are no equivalent physical properties that unequivocally identify which organisms are cognitive and conscious. We have to rely on behavioral criteria, which can be tricky, since different scientists define cognition and consciousness differently. So my goal is less about telling you which animals are cognitive and conscious. I'm not going to even try to do that. What I want to do instead is to understand how our four realms interact and make us what and who we are across all of these different kinds of realms that we have. So let's look at this in another way. So on the bottom left, you see a brown panel there. That includes all organisms that have ever lived. They are all biological beings. Now, some biological beings are animals. I know I'm repeating myself, but I just want to make sure you understand. And that means that they have a neurobiological realm because they have a nervous system. And that provides neural control over the body, which allows more effective use of the body than if you don't have neural control. Now, some animals, and it looks pretty clear that mammals and birds clearly have cognitive capacities. Maybe some others, but again, I'm not going down the road of defining and debating which animals have cognition and consciousness. I'm just saying mammals and birds look like they have cognition. Humans definitely have consciousness, but it's hard to know which other animals have consciousness because it's, there's just all we have is behavior, and behavior is not a very good output of consciousness, as I'll talk about later. So I'm focusing on humans right now. I don't want to get stuck on other animals, so let's just go with humans. So let's start with the biological realm. So here we have life. Life depends on metabolism to keep the individual alive and on replication to keep the species alive. And metabolism and replication have lots of parts. I'm not going to go into all the details about this. Just want you to understand that metabolism keeps the individual alive, replication keeps the species alive. So a biologist named Leo Buss once said, new organisms not only possess novel features, but also retain features of the group they diverged from. So what he's saying is that new or newly changed features often become the primary target of natural selection going forward because they're less stable. They haven't been around as long. But the basic life-sustaining properties, physiological functions, have been repeatedly tested for their survival value and tend to have changed relatively little in the entire history of life and the evolution of new species. More often, the changes involve these new processes that control the way the organism's particular kind of body interacts with its environment in supporting its kind of metabolism and sustaining life. But metabolism and reproduction go back a long ways. Those remain, they change a little bit over the course of life. But in order to live, you have to have metabolism. And in order to reproduce, you have to be able to replicate in this way. So these are very fundamental things that have been there since the beginning of life in one way or another. So, going back now 3.7 billion years ago. So here we have kind of the history of life. At the very bottom, you see unicellular prokaryote. A typical example of that would be like a bacterial cell. So in these cells, you have those little squiggles. Those are strands of DNA. And those are not enclosed in anything. So the unicellular prokaryotes, like bacteria, have free-floating DNA, and their metabolism is also in there as well. Now, with unicellular eukaryotes, that would be things like protozoa, which are the unicellular ancestors of animals, protozoa. In protozoa, you see some different things. The DNA is sequestered within a membrane, and it's for replication, but also metabolism is sequestered within its own membrane. So you have these sequestrations of the life-sustaining properties inside the cell in unicellular eukaryotes as opposed to bacterial cells. So in these unicellular eukaryotes, when they gave rise to multicellular organisms, so different unicellular eukaryotes gave rise to plants, fungi, and animals, but we're mainly talking about animals here. So what you see is that you get multicellular organisms. So you have cells with you have organisms with multiple cells inside the cell membrane. But that's not very efficient because it becomes more important when you can collect those cells into tissues. And tissues can then become systems, and systems can become to control the body. So humans and almost all other animals are complex multicellular eukaryotes with lots of tissues, lots of systems, and so forth. So we see you start with the same thing, and you climb all the way through the tree of life, and you still have the same fundamental survival capacities of metabolism and replication, but they're sequestered in different kinds of structures that keep us alive. So let's go to the neurobiological realm. So the standard way to think about the nervous system is in terms of a central nervous system and a peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system consists of nerves and neurons that control body tissues, but outside of the brain and spinal cord. So the central nervous system sends a command, the peripheral nervous system carries it out and produces responses. So the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system are usually each divided into a somatic component and a visceral component. So in the brain, in the central nervous system, the visceral nervous system, this visceral control in the brain sends information to the visceral control in the periphery, and that controls your heart and your digestion and lungs and all of that stuff. And the somatic, by the same token, in the brain sends commands to your somatic nervous system, and that allows you to control your muscles, that allow you to behave and so forth. So this is the standard way to think about it. But there's a guy named Alfred Sherwood Romer, a paleontologist, comparative paleontologist, who in the 1950s and then again in the 1970s published the same paper. And what he's done is he's taken the traditional view on the left side, where the somatic and visceral are components of the CNS and PNS, and turned it all the way around. Instead, what he says is that the nervous system is primarily divided into somatic and visceral components, and each of those has a central and a peripheral representation. Now, what's the difference? What's the big deal? Why did he say it, and what does it mean? So, well, one of his main points was that the visceral and somatic existence components, these go back long before there was a nervous system. Unicellular protozoa had visceral and somatic components in their one cell. So that means that the visceral and somatic components predates nervous system, and therefore Romer is correct in putting this idea together, because what he's saying is the visceral and somatic was there before the nervous system, and then the visceral and somatic components acquired nervous systems to more effectively interact with the body, as we've been talking about. So early animals like jellyfish, for example, we see that they have a peripheral, they don't have a central nervous system, but they have a kind of wide-scale peripheral nervous system that's all over the body. And that peripheral nervous system, which is called a diffuse nervous system, has visceral and somatic components. And so it's the same thing as in the unicellular protozoa, but now much more efficient because you have a nervous system. And then you get these other animals. Most animals are bilateral with a front, a back, a top and a bottom, and a left and a right. Jellyfish only have a top and a bottom. So a bilateral animal is a much more complicated thing, and it has a central nervous system that controls the peripheral and that controls the body functions, whether somatic or visceral. So I hope that's not too complicated. So through natural selection, the visceral and somatic functions of the body of the unicellular protozoan ancestors were carried forward in early animals and their peripheral nervous systems and into the central nervous systems as animals diversified. So defining feature of neurobiological realm responses are that they are stimulus-elicited automatic neural activities. For example, sensory motor integration in relation to reflexes, motor programs, instincts, fixed action patterns, Pavlovian conditioning, stimulus response, habit learning. These are all fundamental activities that require no cognition. Cognition is not required for any of these activities. Now, what's interesting, and the reason I want to just pause for a second, I've spent so many years working on Pavlovian conditioning, and all of those years I've emphasized, and that's sometimes not as clear as I should have been, but I've emphasized that when I'm studying Pavlovian conditioning, I'm studying implicit learning, implicitly controlled, unconsciously controlled behaviors. But a lot of my work got confused because the idea that we called it fear behavior or fear conditioning made it seem like we were talking about the conscious experience of fear is involved in all of this. And so the reason I'm telling you all about these different kinds of other things, because so many researchers have taken these primitive responses, use those in relation to fear, and then name the behavior fear. And so everybody in the world thinks you're talking about the conscious experience of fear when you're talking about reflexes and motor programs and instincts and all of that stuff. So this is a diagram that goes back many, many years. And I didn't realize when I was first reading about Romer, I didn't realize how committed I had been to the Romer model without even knowing it. So here we have a conditioned threat that goes into sensory processing systems. That takes it to the amygdala. One output of the amygdala goes to the visceral central nervous system, and that controls the peripheral visceral nervous system that controls your heart rate, sweating, hormones, and all the other stuff known as visceral responses. Another output of the amygdala goes to the hypothalamus that controls somatic responses in the midbrain, spinal cord, and to skeletal muscles to control freezing or fleeing and so forth. So I was a Romerian before I knew it. So again, these circuits do not make conscious fear. They detect and respond to innate and learned threats with pre-programmed motor reactions. Reactions, not actions. Fear is the conscious awareness of being in harm's way. Okay, let's go to the cognitive realm. So as I said, each scientist has their own definition of cognition and consciousness. And so the only way I can make what I'm about to tell you make sense is to tell you what my definition of the cognitive realm is and the conscious realm, and hope that that makes some sense to you. So for me, the cognitive realm involves mental models, that is, predictions based on internal representations. So my definition is the capacity to construct mental models of the world and to use these in thinking, planning, deciding, acting, and feeling. Now, there have been lots of discussions of mental models over the years, but I want to emphasize Kenneth Craik's 1943 definition in The Nature of Explanation. I think he was probably the first to introduce this idea of mental models. And what he said was, if the organism carries a small-scale model of external reality and of its own possible actions within its head, it is able to try out various alternatives, conclude which is the best of them, react to future situations before they arise, utilize the knowledge of past events in dealing with the present and the future, and in every way to react in a fuller, much fuller, safer, and more competent manner to the emergencies which face it. So that's just a beautiful definition of what cognition is to me. Now, there were other instances of mental models. Tolman's cognitive map was a mental model, or at least could be a mental model. O'Keefe and Nadel's hippocampus as a cognitive map also could be a mental model. And I say also because recently I've come to realize that you can have cognitive maps you can have spatial maps based on either mental models or upon more automatic processes that are more in the neurobiological realm, like stimulus response habit learning, which is not based on mental model. So the cognitive maps in the hippocampus are real, but not all spatial maps in the hippocampus are cognitive maps. I hope that's clear. Another example was Philip Johnson Laird, Mental Models book Towards a Cognitive Science of Language, Inference, and Consciousness. But I want to jump ahead to Nathaniel Daw and his colleagues. Nathaniel, many of you may know, was at NYU for many years. And he and Niv and Diane were together in London in the 90s. And they came up with a model-free versus model-based idea based on machine learning. They got this out of machine learning. And so I assumed that being in the UK and generating a mental model kind of approach, they had gotten it from Craik. But instead, Nathaniel tells me he was really riffing off of John O'Keefe, who was just down the hall, basically at UCL. So it wasn't really based on the UCL Cambridge connection where Craik was, but it was a kind of down the hall connection between O'Keefe and Daw. So the importance of this is that model-free behavior is pure neurobiological realm stuff. It has no cognition, whereas model-based is cognitive, and so it has cognition. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. And this goes back to that thing about Buss, who said the old changes less than the new. So here we have the habit system, stimulus response habit system of reptiles. So you have a stimulus outside in the world. It goes to the sensory cortex. Sensory cortex takes it to the basal ganglia. Sensory cortex also goes to the motor cortex, and the motor cortex receives outputs from the, well, interacts both ways with the basal ganglia as well. Now, if at the same time the sight of food is paired with the taste of food, that can release dopamine in the midbrain. The dopamine in the midbrain that's released goes to the striatum, and it solidifies that sensory motor connection in the dorsal striatum, in the basal ganglia. And as a result, the next time the stimulus comes along, you don't have to relearn it. You just go to the basal ganglion, you just go to the sensory motor cortex, and you have the stimulus response habit approach to food, which comes out automatically. Now, okay, that's fine for reptiles, but now we're going to look at the transition from reptile-like mammals to mammals. Well, first, let me say something. Eric Klan, of course, one of the greatest neuroscientists of modern times, also noted that evolution of novel behavior circuits often involves small changes in existing circuits. A very bus-like idea. Small changes in existing circuits. So the old is there, and you modify the existing to make a new circuit. All right. Now, what we want to do is look at how the habit system of reptiles was carried forward into mammals. So the habit system of reptiles is represented in the blue shading there on the left. And mammals still have that habit system. But in addition, they have all that purple stuff to the right of that. And instead of just having a sensory motor cortex, they have a prefrontal cortex, a medial prefrontal cortex, that can produce very simple mental models that allow them to hold information in mind, integrating information on the right side with body states and reinforcers and so on that come into the middle model and become part of the middle model to make decisions in the future without having to do the stimulus response thing, but simply to have a model now that you don't even need the stimulus. You can just have the model and think about it and produce the response. So mammals are taking the old, the basal ganglia and neocortex, and adding prefrontal cortex and adding basal ganglia connections to allow mammals to do things that reptiles can't do, which is to have cognition. Okay, now we get to the conscious realm. So, is conscious a scientific mystery? Yes, in the sense that the mechanisms underlying biological inheritance or bacterial infections were mysterious before they were figured out. But if it's not physical, then it's not a scientific problem. If it's physical, it's a scientific problem that can potentially be solved. So the scientific pursuit of what it feels like to be conscious should not be limited by philosophical concerns about such feelings being too hard for science. Because if you are like my colleague David, everyone knows David at NYU. So if you're like David, you make subjective experience qualia, and these non-physical properties that you are making into are non-scientific, but you set them up as a scientific problem in a way that can only lead to failure. I'm not, David Chalmers is fine, that he's perfectly allowed to, is a philosopher. He can say what he can do philosophy on this. But when scientists take the philosophy, and philosophy has been very, very useful to science, but we have to draw a line between when we can use it and when it's not that useful. And to make something scientific non-physical, I don't think has any use in science. So William James once said, "Our reasonings have not established the non-existence of the soul. They've only proved its superfluity for scientific purposes." I think the same can be said about dualistic and panpsychic notions of non-physical qualia. They're fine as philosophical concerns, but they're not scientific constructs. So what are some scientific notions of consciousness? One is creature consciousness, a condition of being alive, awake, and behaviorally responsive to environmental stimuli. This exists in all animals. If you're alive and awake and responsive, which all animals are by definition, unless they're in a coma or something like that. And another is mental state consciousness, the capacity to experience the world and one's relationship to it. And I would say this only exists in some animals. Now, we could also throw in sentience. but it's kind of a loosey-goosey term, and I'm not going to say much about it. I think it needs to be defined more precisely before we put it in the middle there. So I'm not here to debate theories of consciousness or to tell you which animals have consciousness. I'm only here to tell you my views about this stuff. So let me go on. I need to make one distinction to do that. So there's been a lot of research on the brain mechanisms of consciousness starting in the 1990s. And, a lot of people think that consciousness research in the brain began in the 1990s when Christoph Koch and Francis Crick proposed this idea about, we should study the visual system because we know a lot about it. And that would be a way to study consciousness. I think that's a good idea. It makes sense. It's true. But people have been studying the visual system in consciousness long before, like when I got involved in split brain work, everything we did was visual. And we were studying the brain in consciousness. So it didn't all start happening in 1990, like it's sometimes made out to be. But one of the advantages and one of the good things they did, Christoph Koch, is they put a neuroanatomical framework forward. So what they said was that, that the visual cortex interacts with the prefrontal cortex, and that allows some kind of conscious experience to be made based on that visual input. Now, Crick died, so we don't have much to say about him about all this. But Koch went on to become a panpsychist and has denied all of this this contribution that he made here with that the lateral prefrontal cortex has some important role. But anyway, the point is that I want to talk about two kinds of theories now that have started in philosophy, basically. We have first order theories that propose that lower order representations in the visual cortex are sufficient. You don't need any kind of re-representation or redefinition of what is in visual cortex. The visual cortex does the whole thing on its own. When you see, you're seeing through your visual cortex. So people like Ned Block are fans of this theory. In fact, that's kind of basically Ned's theory. But in addition, what they say as well, the prefrontal cortex is involved, but it's only in the kind of cognitive not experiencing of it, but cognitive representation of it. Now, another kind of theory is like global workspace theory or higher order theory. Both of these propose that you need prefrontal cortex in one way or another. And the two theories have different ideas. And I'm more inclined towards the higher order approach. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. So in real life, as opposed to psychophysics labs, which a lot of consciousness research is done in, experiences tend to be multimodal and involve a variety of lower order inputs. It's not, so it can't all be happening in visual cortex because you don't just see the apple, you imagine its taste and smell and all of that kind of stuff too. Or if you're in a restaurant, you're sitting in the Chinese restaurant, the steaming fish is put on your plate and all the aromas as well as the sights and the sound that it's making, and all of that comes together. So in most of our life, I think we have multimodal experiences rather than unimodal. So besides that, the prefrontal cortex circuitry potentially involved in consciousness is far, far more complex, and its inputs are much more diverse and rich than typically acknowledged. And so that is meaningless, really. That is just like a cartoon. So what I want to show you is what it really looks like. So instead of asking about what kind of information flow is there from sensory cortex to lateral prefrontal cortex, let's ask about the full range of inputs to lateral prefrontal cortex. So that lateral prefrontal is that green thing in the middle there. And we're going to start with sensory cortex. So, you got visual cortex, auditory, somatosensory, whatever, going there. But in addition to sensory information going to lateral prefrontal cortex, you've got All of these memory structures, medial temporal lobe, temporal pole, superior temporal sulcus, parieto-occipital junction, these all process memory and multimodal experiences. And they are also necessary for perception, because without memory, sensory information is meaningless. You've got to combine memory and sensation in order to get a perception. And it's through that kind of combination of sensation and memory that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is getting conceptual information about what is out there. It's not just a word, it's not just a semantic fact, it's a conception about what's in the world. Now, in addition, though, you have all these prefrontal areas that are also connecting with the dorsolateral and ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, like the orbital frontal cortex, the ventromedial frontal cortex, anterior cingulate, dorsomedial frontal pole. There are different kinds of cortex involved, granular, subgranular, but the point is that all these prefrontal areas are also projecting to this working memory area in green. That's where the dorsolateral, ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, working memory, that's where we conceptualize and so forth. But look at all of the inputs that are going there. It's not just like a little thing from the visual cortex going there and all of a sudden you're happy with what you see. It's all of this stuff coming together conceptually. So I call this a multi-state hierarchical framework. This perspective replaces the traditional volley between sensory cortex and lateral prefrontal cortex with a more complex anatomical arrangement consisting of a hierarchy of structures, each of which creates different kinds of states that are re-represented and redescribed by circuits of PFC, and they contribute to mental modeling and conscious experience. I've often talked about this in relation to higher order theory, but it's relevant to, I think, many theories of consciousness. So it's getting late, so I'm not going to repeat this because it's already said. Jorge Morales, a philosopher, said in Ledoux' model, the representations processed by PFC are diverse and redundant. They have different degrees of abstraction that reflect their origin in multiple kinds of systems. As a result, the focus of awareness can change as an episode develops over time. The system is dynamic and distributed and has many backdoors and backups. So I think, I mean, it's just getting interesting here, and I don't want to. I feel like I need to say some more, even though it's very late. Let me just briefly put this into a conceptual model where you have a physical or social threat in the world. The sensory information goes in. It contributes to the mental model. Threat detection also contributes to the mental model. Memory contributes to mental model by way of schema. So the idea is that you go from sensation and memory to schema. Schema then become the template for the mental model. The mental model is then a narration that allows you to experience the world. However, you see that I have that narration in pre-conscious, not in consciousness. So it is not a conscious narration. It is a pre-conscious narration, what we might call, well, I'll get to that in a second. But the interesting thing is that the idea here is we have a kind of processing channel that is amodal, that allows you to both experience the world, to give self-reports about it, and to control goal-directed behaviors, all on the basis of the mental model. Now, this is the split brain study, and this is where it all comes from. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. You said, we said, why'd you do that? Why'd you point to those things? This is the left hemisphere talking. It said, I saw a chicken claw, so I picked the chicken and used a shovel to clean up the chicken shed. The left hemisphere had no idea about why the left hand pointed to the shovel, because the left hemisphere did not see the snow scene. It saw that it pointed to a chicken and a shovel and said, you need a chicken to clean out the chicken shed. So it drew an inference from its own behavior being produced non-consciously in this case. So the hypothesis is that we humans think we control our behavior. Observing behaviors that are controlled non-consciously is discomforting. It produces cognitive dissonance. And given the multiplicity of non-conscious behavioral control systems in the brain, dissonance-reducing narratives may help maintain a sense of mental unity. Now, this is basically what I just told you in that previous picture. And I'm not going to repeat it. I just want to say that what I've given you is an idea of two mental models, a non-conscious mental model that can control behavior and writing and signing or whatever else, but also fosters a mental model that you can consciously experience. And that mental model that you consciously experience goes back to model one, allowing you to be conscious of the content that you just processed in the second mental model. So it allows you to have a conscious loop there that is taking in not only the non-conscious information from downstream stuff, but also upstream stuff from having just been conscious of something. Again, through an amodal kind of representation into the mental model, it comes back into consciousness. Now, once you're conscious of stuff, you can then speak about it and write about it, have goal-directed behaviors and so forth. So it's kind of a volitional output of the conscious mental model. I'm not going to explain all the reasons why it's important because I'm out of time, but I just want to give you a paragraph that this graduate student at Yale suggested about how could we tell the difference between whether one problem is that if we have a conscious mental model and a non-conscious one, both producing behavior and speech, how do you know which one is talking and acting at the same time? So Joan came up with this idea. One possibility is the difference between verbal reports controlled by the two mental models lies not in the superficial words, what people say, but in the relation between these words. That is how people move from one idea to another. This is the process known as semantic progression. The more implicit, spontaneously constructed verbal reports that arise from the preconscious state may involve more jumping around and from idea to idea, compared with more intentionally constructed reports arising from the conscious model. Semantic progression has been measured through existing natural language processing models like latent semantic analysis or unsupervised embedders to compute the semantic similarity between words and sentences. Words in the same paragraph may show greater semantic similarity than words across paragraphs. Indeed, these types of analyses have been used to explore the progression of ideas in narrative text and in film, and might be leveraged to distinguish reports based on preconscious versus conscious states of mind. I'm sorry I used up so much time. There's a documentary about my life work in music on Amazon. You can find that if you're interested. Mike, Santa, Eric, Elizabeth, all kinds of people, Roseanne Cash, Lenny Kaye, musicians. And then if I had another half hour, I would talk about an alternative to unidimensional views of consciousness, and talk about three kinds of memory systems and three kinds of consciousness, but I'm going to leave it at that for now. So let me stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much. Fascinating. I would like to hear another hour. But we have a few questions in the Q&A. So do you want to let some people into the panel to ask their questions, or do you want to just read the questions? Because I think they might require some clarity.
Right. I could enable successively each questioner
So Dustin
to sort of
Freeman?
speak, yeah, or join the panel.
Just to be clear, I have to leave close to 1 or very soon after, so it might be best just to have the chat things rather than the interacting with people, because that would take a long time.
Oh, I see.
But whatever you guys want to do, it might be one question if we do that. But go ahead.
Well, let's see. Jeremy Manning asks, thanks for your presentation. What is your view of individual consciousness being uploaded to computer networks, a la Novacine? And would this affect your theory of the four realms of existence?
No, I don't. I'm not a big fan of AI consciousness. AI is about complex information processing. Consciousness is something a little different. Just because it's complex processing, I don't think it takes you all the way to the consciousness finishing line. I think, I'd like to just say a word about the consciousness finishing line, because, in animals, and, if we can't get it in animals, how are we going to get it in AI? But anyway, in animals, we can get them to the consciousness finishing line through Tulving's, episodic memory and semantic memory, for example. We don't know that those become autonoetic consciousness and noetic consciousness in animals, but we know that they have the cognitive wherewithal to get to the finish line. But we don't know that they cross. And, if we can't get it in animals, I don't think we can be able to get it in AI.
And Phil asks, do you have a hypothesis that reconciles your theory with the scientific evidence of near-death experiences where people gain verifiable knowledge during a time when biologically the brain is dead and no activity that would be commonly be seen is measured? I don't know if they're really brain
so
dead.
I mean, I know nothing about that, so I don't want to pontificate to. But maybe there's some memories that are stored that the brain is dying or like being shut down. But do we know that every neuron in the brain is like off? And some of those may be able to hold on to some information. And all you need when you wake up is a little bit of information to then spin a narrative about what might have been going
on. So Dustin, do you still have the question about a good example of cognition without consciousness? You were talking about the planet. Yeah, go ahead.
I just asked what's an example of cognition without consciousness, but I asked that before you were explaining the hidden models concept, or sorry, mental models concept. So that was
right.
I consider that resolved.
Let's take the whole cognitive unconscious. I mean, that's basically what cognition without consciousness refers to.
Yeah, I was sort of interested in, I'm a conscious being, I move around and do things, but I guess like my day-to-day actions could be sort of divided into cognitive actions versus conscious actions. Is that sort of an interesting, useful, falsifiable split one could make?
Yes. But also I would throw in the neurobiological actions, which neither cognition nor consciousness. And we do a lot of that too,
Oh, yeah, I'd expect like my heart rate increasing while I'm sprinting. So, even though I'm a conscious being, some of my actions are only cognitive without consciousness. Is that like correct? Is that like, even interesting or useful to think about?
What's it again?
So my day-to-day actions interacting with the world, some of those are neurobiological. Yeah. Some of those actions are cognitive. Some of those actions might be conscious. So if someone's throwing a ball at me, I duck. I maybe see that as more neurobiological than.
Yep.
I'm just curious if this is sort of like a useful. Can you?
Yeah, I mean, that's basically what. That's what.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's useful, but that's what I proposed in the book. That that you need each one is kind of built on the one before, but it also helps the one before.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
So I'd like to point out that although Joe has to jump off, we can keep this open for a few more minutes. Munson wants to weigh in. There's a
you guys can
maybe we can
let me have it while I'm away.
Yeah, maybe we can have one more question that's in the Q&A while Joe is here.
So which one?
Yeah, there's a question from Karthik and from Aditya. So maybe the earlier one first.
Okay. So Aditya?
Maybe Karthik first and then Aditya.
Oh, Karthik, okay. The elementary particles perspective. Quantum superposition suggests that consciousness plays a role in the collapse of these states into one.
That's above my pay grade.
That's what?
That's above my pay grade. I don't know anything about physics. I mean, everybody's, eligible to have their own theories of consciousness. And what I'm talking about is stuff that's biologically constrained. And, maybe we'll find something deep in the, physics. But right now, my concerns are, I'm not going to live that long. So I'm going to just worry about what I have to say here.
And Aditya asks, do you have any thoughts on genetic imprinting of consciousness? Is there any research or possibility that effects of consciousness can be epigenetically encoded?
Again, that's out of my territory, and I don't like to talk out of my territory.
Yes.
So you get in trouble when you do that.
That's fair.
When I get off, you guys can say whatever you want about it.
Right. And someone is also asking about system 1 and system 2 thinking a la Daniel
Yeah,
Kahneman.
yeah. So that I rewrite system 1 and 2 in the cognitive part of the book into 3 systems, because there's a lot of stuff in what I would call the neurobiological realm that was pushed into the cognitive realm, and you need to separate that out. But also you need to redefine the whole cognitive realm into conscious and cognitive, but not conscious, and neither conscious nor cognitive. So those are the 3.
Right. Well, it's just 101. So I want to thank Dr. LeDoux so much. It's absolutely
thank you, Barry.
Fascinating conversation.
Thank you so much.
Oh, sure.
Thanks, Joe. We will stop the official recording here.
So we might be in touch a little bit by